In the heart of the Urals, amid the soot-stained brick of Perm's industrial stations, there lingers a story so strange it survived the silence of the Soviet years. They call it the Clockroom, a storage basement beneath the old Perm railway station, where, according to testimonies both whispered and classified, every timepiece brought inside stopped at precisely 3:17 a.m. The phenomenon was never admitted in public, but fragments of internal reports, personnel transfers, and confiscated diaries suggest that the mystery stretched across decades. It began, officially at least, in the winter of 1952, when a night guard was found dead at his post, his watch frozen at 03:17. His body showed no wounds. The following week, two more workers reported the same, their pocket watches halting in unison while they remained alive. Soon after, the basement was closed off under repairs. What makes the story persist is not just the halted watches, but the silence that followed. Official timetables from Perm's station archives show adjustments, with entire trains rescheduled or rerouted during nights when the basement had been open. A declassified NKVD memo dated 1953 mentions persistent disruptions in temporal stability at a railway node of strategic importance. The file bears multiple redactions, but the phrase recurs: 03:17 threshold event. The document ends with an order to secure the site and monitor all personnel. No conclusion is given. Local rumor filled in what officialdom erased. Old station hands swore that if you entered the basement near midnight and waited, you would hear a faint ticking that did not match any clock above ground. By 3:17, the sound ceased, and all devices, watches, station clocks, even metronomes, would fail. Some claimed their hearts skipped, as if the body itself was forced into alignment with a hidden rhythm. One porter told his nephew that he saw the shadows in the basement moving slightly out of sync, as though the light itself had slipped behind by a fraction of a second. He vanished in 1954, dismissed as a deserter. For decades, the basement remained locked, its entrance bricked over. Yet the rumors did not stop. Train passengers arriving in Perm at night sometimes reported that the station clocks jumped backwards by several minutes, only to correct themselves at dawn. A 1961 letter seized from a local schoolteacher spoke of a time pocket beneath the rails, where workers whispered that voices of the dead could be heard faintly if you listened at the right hour. The teacher was arrested for spreading mystical hysteria. His students later recalled that he had always checked his wristwatch obsessively, as if waiting for it to stop. By the late 1960s, the site was reclassified under military jurisdiction. An internal logistics file from the Ministry of Railways noted the allocation of temporal stabilization equipment to the Perm station, though no such devices were ever publicly acknowledged. KGB reports of the period describe anomalies in communications. Telegraphs sent from Perm arrived with timestamps impossible to reconcile. Messages logged as received minutes before they were transmitted. One agent remarked in frustration, "This is not a technical failure. It is a place where the hour itself collapses." His note was struck from the final record. Civilian witnesses continued to surface. A woman working as a ticket clerk in 1973 recalled that during night shifts, she saw passengers walking past her desk who never appeared on manifests, carrying tickets stamped with dates from the previous day. Another porter swore that a freight shipment vanished entirely after being stored overnight in the basement. 20 crates of machine parts gone, replaced by air and dust. He filed a report. It was returned stamped "Error of Inventory." He left Perm within a month, taking only his family and a single broken clock. The strangest testimony emerged from a soldier assigned to guard the station during the Afghan war years. He claimed that once, during routine patrol, he entered the basement by mistake and found it filled not with boxes, but with rows of desks, each occupied by men in uniforms decades out of date. They all stared at him, silent, before dissolving into shadow. His wristwatch shattered at exactly 3:17. He was later discharged for psychiatric instability. His account survives only in a Samizdat interview published in the late 1980s. With Glasnost, fragments of the secret seeped further. Local journalists attempted to investigate, but their reports were suppressed. One article, circulated briefly in 1989 before being pulled, described the basement as a chamber where Soviet time itself broke ranks. It cited unnamed sources who claimed that the party once considered demolishing the station entirely, but feared the anomaly would only migrate elsewhere. "You cannot kill a wound in time," one informant said. "You can only wall it up." Even after the collapse of the USSR, silence persisted. The station underwent renovations, and the basement was officially removed, though no construction records show its disposal. Yet train workers continued to whisper. Digital devices failed mysteriously during night runs. Cameras refused to record below ground. One contractor admitted to hearing dozens of watches ticking in unison in a sealed room, even though no clocks were present. He quit after a single week. Today, the legend of the Perm Clockroom remains unresolved. Is it a Cold War experiment gone wrong? A Soviet attempt to manipulate time? Or simply a myth born from railway superstitions? The surviving files point to something stranger. A convergence of human schedules, industrial machinery, and natural anomaly that fractured reality at one precise second, 0317. Whether it was a doorway, a wound, or a warning, no one can say. What remains is absence. Missing reports, vanished workers, sealed corridors. The only certainty lies in the recurring testimonies of those who dared to enter. Every watch, every clock, every mechanism halted together, marking the same second in the dead of night. And the chilling question endures, if time itself stopped in that basement, what else might have slipped free before it began again? The first official attempts to explain the anomaly began in the early 1950s, shortly after the unexplained deaths and mechanical failures were noted. Internal railway documents, marked with the stamp of the Ministry of Transport, described the event only as synchronization disruption. Engineers dispatched from Sverdlovsk reported that the problem was localized entirely to the basement, beneath Perm's main station, an otherwise unremarkable storage space lined with brick walls and rusting pipes. They brought modern instruments of the era: chronometers, oscillographs, electrical timers. Every device, no matter how precise, stopped at the same second, 0317. Even when the tests were staggered at different hours, the devices failed at that exact mark during the following night. The results were so uniform that the lead engineer refused to sign the final report, noting that the measurements indicate not equipment malfunction, but an external controlling force. His name does not appear in later records. The NKVD, already suspicious of sabotage, took over the inquiry. A special team of operatives and scientists sealed off the basement for nearly a month. Witnesses in the station recalled men entering with heavy crates of apparatus, cables running like veins down into the earth. The area above ground buzzed with electricity, lights flickering in the concourse at odd intervals. By morning, the guards would emerge pale and silent. None of them spoke of what they saw. What little has surfaced suggests the investigators attempted to map temporal distortions using synchronized atomic references. Yet every logbook ends the same way, blank pages after the hour of 03:17. One torn note, recovered decades later, reads, "The second repeats, shadows double." Rumors spread quickly among workers. Porters avoided night shifts, claiming they could hear a faint humming through the floorboards just before the fatal minute arrived. Station clocks upstairs would sometimes fall out of step, dragging the entire schedule into confusion. A conductor later admitted that during one journey, his train's chronometer reset to 0317 no matter how often he wound it, as though the locomotive itself had carried the hour inside. These stories were never published, but they circulated in whispers, weaving the basement into a tapestry of dread. By the mid-1950s, locals began to connect the anomaly with broader fears of the age. The Cold War was tightening, and rumors of secret experiments filled the air. Some believed the basement was part of a hidden project, an attempt to control time itself, to bend the clockwork of history in the USSR's favor. Others whispered that the station had been built over something older, a fault in the earth that no construction could heal. In one account, an elderly janitor recalled that long before the Soviet renovation, the site had been marked by strange sinkholes where livestock refused to graze. "The ground never wanted to hold the hour," he said. The state responded with silence. The basement remained sealed, its entrance bricked and guarded by locked doors. Officially, no anomaly existed, yet trains continued to suffer unexplained delays whenever they passed through Perm after midnight. Freight manifests recorded goods disappearing from wagons, only to reappear days later without explanation. Timetables carried erasures, scratched-out numbers, gaps where an hour seemed to have dissolved into nothing. A confidential 1956 dispatch from the Ministry of Railways, uncovered years later, contained a single alarming line. "The station is functional, but time itself is unreliable." For those who lived in the city, the basement became an unspoken curse. Parents warned their children never to look at the station clock after dark. Workers swore that their own wristwatches ticked louder in Perm than anywhere else, as if pulled toward that frozen second. And through it all, the legend hardened. At 03:17 a.m., the world beneath the station stopped, holding its breath, while the rest of the city marched on, unaware that under their feet, the very measure of time was breaking apart. The 1960s brought with them new ambitions in the Soviet Union: nuclear power plants, space launches, bold declarations of technological mastery. Yet beneath Perm's railway station, the anomaly endured, silent and unyielding. The bricked-off basement, known only to a handful of officials as the Clockroom, remained closed to the public. Still, it never truly disappeared from official concern. Files from regional party committees, later unearthed in fragmentary form, reveal that the site was monitored monthly for stability. What that stability referred to was never explained in the surviving text. Those who worked at the station began to notice patterns. Train delays consistently clustered around the same hour of the night. The power grid suffered unexplained surges at 03:17, sometimes frying bulbs across entire platforms. When asked to explain, electricians muttered about phantom loads and oscillations in the current, but the language was vague, evasive. A junior technician, whose personal diary was confiscated, wrote that he heard the power lines hum louder every night around that time, until the sound seemed to come not from the wires, but from the air itself. His last entry ends with the words, "The ticking has moved into my head." The anomaly also began to intrude on communications. Telegraph operators reported signals stamped with impossible time codes. Messages would arrive marked hours before they were sent, creating bureaucratic chaos that supervisors attributed to clerical errors. But some operators confided in colleagues that they felt an invisible hand pressing against their work, lines that skipped seconds, dots and dashes collapsing into silence. In one incident, a telegraph operator supposedly received his own outgoing message before typing it. The story spread quietly among railway staff, though the man himself disappeared shortly afterward, reassigned to an unknown post in Kazakhstan. Among locals, the legend deepened. Residents began to call the sealed basement the Chazy Pokoya, the clocks of rest, as if time itself went to sleep there. Teenagers dared one another to press their ears to the bricked walls. Some claimed they heard a chorus of watches ticking faintly behind the bricks. Others insisted they heard whispers counting down. In the winter of 1964, a boy disappeared after sneaking into the restricted area during a school excursion. The official explanation was that he ran away, but classmates swore they saw him standing at the top of the stairwell leading down to the basement, before vanishing as the station clock struck 3:17. The government response grew harsher. By the late 1960s, access to the basement was guarded not by railway officials, but by men in plain clothes, likely KGB. Workers who asked too many questions were transferred abruptly, their files marked with vague accusations of Disciplinary instability. Perm itself became a hub for secretive visitors, engineers, physicists, and officers who arrived on night trains and disappeared into the station's depths. For weeks afterward, workers would notice strange disruptions, station clocks jumping backwards, announcements garbled, schedules altered with no explanation. Whispers circulated of experiments conducted during these visits. One story describes a group of men lowering dozens of synchronized chronometers into the basement. All of them stopped at 0317, but not in unison. They froze in a staggered sequence, as if time itself was collapsing in waves. Another tale spoke of animals, dogs, rabbits, brought into the chamber. They survived, but afterward their movements became irregular, hesitant, as if their sense of time had been damaged. A conductor claimed he saw one of the dogs days later, staring at the station clock with such intensity that its body trembled. The story was never confirmed, yet it persisted in the oral lore of station staff. Some files hint at attempts to weaponize the anomaly. A fragment attributed to the Ministry of Defense speculates on the possibility of temporal suspension zones capable of halting enemy machinery. The language is half scientific, half paranoid, reflecting both Cold War ambition and desperation. But no evidence survives of practical results. Whatever was attempted, it ended in silence. The clockroom remained sealed, unyielding to science or strategy. By the end of the decade, the myth had begun to bleed beyond Perm. Travelers on long-haul trains spoke of peculiar distortions when their journeys crossed through the city. Watches stopped briefly, meals seemed to stretch or compress, and passengers awoke at destinations hours earlier or later than expected. Railway authorities blamed poor scheduling, but letters sent to Moscow tell another story. One particularly disturbing account, written by a party secretary in Sverdlovsk, described a train arriving before it had officially departed. "The paperwork cannot be reconciled," he wrote. "Either we have lost an hour, or it has been stolen from us." Through all of this, ordinary people adapted in their own way. Superstitions flourished. Families warned each other not to travel through Perm on the 17th day of any month. Station workers avoided looking at their watches near dawn. Some even carried broken clocks in their pockets, believing that if their timepieces were already stopped, the basement could not touch them. Still, the mystery persisted, insoluble and patient. No matter how many guards were posted, how many walls were bricked, how many documents were censored, the same truth resurfaced. Every clock brought near the basement stopped at 3:17 a.m., and though the state did everything to suppress this fact, the pattern etched itself into collective memory like a wound in the fabric of history. It was as if the Soviet Union itself had a hidden hour, repeating endlessly beneath the station, locked away, yet always threatening to break free. By the close of the 1960s, the Perm Clockroom had become a paradox, officially non-existent, yet undeniable. Trains still ran, the station still bustled, workers still labored under the portraits of Lenin and Brezhnev, but under the brick and steel, in the locked chamber where no one dared to linger, time itself remained broken, circling endlessly back to the same second of the same night, as if waiting for something or someone to return. The 1970s marked a turning point for the Perm Clockroom. Where the 1950s and 60s were years of denial and suppression, the next decade became an age of experimentation, secret, desperate, and increasingly reckless. The Cold War was at its height, and any anomaly that defied explanation became, in the eyes of Moscow, a potential weapon or a potential threat. The Clockroom was both. Surviving fragments from military archives suggest that a classified research program, codenamed Chronometer 7, was initiated under the oversight of the Ministry of Railways and the KGB. Its stated objective was to study and stabilize chronometric interference at Perm Railway Node 3. What this meant in practice remains uncertain. but the files hint at repeated experiments involving precision instruments, power grids, and controlled exposure of personnel to the anomaly. The most chilling phrase, repeated in multiple reports, reads simply, "Subject not recovered in same temporal state." Station workers began noticing strange convoys of trucks arriving at night, offloading crates marked with laboratory insignia. For weeks afterward, the entire station would flicker with electrical instability. Lights dimmed, loudspeakers emitted static, and clocks in the concourse would freeze for minutes before resuming as though nothing had happened. Witnesses described a pervasive smell of ozone in the air during these periods, as if a storm were trapped underground. One janitor later told his nephew that when he was ordered to sweep near the sealed basement doors, his broom vibrated in his hands as though the floor beneath him pulsed like a heartbeat. Rumors began to swirl of human experiments. Several young conscripts assigned to guard duty were never seen again after entering the basement. Officially, they were reassigned to distant postings. But one soldier who deserted in 1974 claimed he had witnessed comrades walk into the clockroom at 2:55 a.m., only to never return. "We waited for hours," he recalled in a samizdat interview. "When we opened the door, the room was empty. Only their watches lay on the floor, all frozen at the same second." He was later arrested, his testimony suppressed, but copies of the interview circulated underground, fueling the legend. Engineers, too, began to suffer. Surviving personnel files indicate a spike in neurological illnesses among railway workers assigned to Perm. Symptoms included memory lapses, disorientation, and recurring nightmares about clocks striking endlessly. A woman who worked as a telegraph operator near the station later confided that she often woke at night to find her wristwatch glowing faintly at 3:17, even though no light source was present. When she reported this, her superiors dismissed her as unstable. She was committed to a psychiatric hospital in Sverdlovsk and died within a year. Folklore spread quickly through the city. Children whispered that the basement was a time grave where minutes went to die. Others claimed that at 3:17 a.m., the shadows in the station elongated unnaturally, stretching toward the sealed stairwell as though pulled by an invisible tide. Elders recalled older stories, predating the station itself, of strange gaps in time around the Urals, hunters who returned from the forest with no memory of days, miners who swore they had worked for hours, only to emerge and find dawn had not yet come. To them, the clockroom was simply a continuation of an older wound in the land. In 1977, a catastrophic incident reportedly occurred. A memo, heavily redacted but still legible in places, describes a temporal cascade event that disrupted all clocks across the station simultaneously. For exactly 11 minutes, every device froze at 3:17 a.m., even though the hour had already passed. Train schedules collapsed, telegraphs malfunctioned, and several trains vanished from central monitoring for the duration of the anomaly. When the event ended, the trains reappeared on the grid, but 2 carriages were missing from one freight convoy. No wreckage was ever found. The loss was officially blamed on misreporting, but internal notes from the Ministry of Railways describe it bluntly. Cargo erased in interval. Witnesses grew bolder during the late Brezhnev years, when censorship softened slightly. A retired conductor admitted in a private letter to his son that he had once seen the clockroom door open by mistake. Inside, he described a chamber filled with an unnatural pale glow, like light refracted through glass. At the center of the room stood a massive pile of watches, alarm clocks, and pocket chronometers, all frozen at the same time. "It was like a graveyard of seconds," he wrote. He begged his son never to repeat the story. The letter was intercepted, but copies surfaced decades later in the archives of local historians. Despite these accounts, the party continued to insist that no anomaly existed. In fact, official propaganda during the late 1970s highlighted Perm as a model transport hub of the Soviet future. Photographs of smiling workers, efficient timetables, and modern locomotives were circulated widely. Yet behind the scenes, reports of the anomaly only multiplied. The contradiction itself became a source of dread. The louder the proclamations of normalcy, the deeper the suspicion that something unspeakable was being concealed beneath the bricks of the station. By 1979, the program Chronometer 7 appears to have been quietly abandoned. Files stop abruptly, with no conclusions offered. Personnel involved in the research were transferred, dismissed, or in many cases erased from records entirely. But the problem did not end. That year, passengers aboard a long-distance train from Leningrad to Novosibirsk reported that when passing through Perm, the lights in every carriage extinguished at once. Watches stopped, and passengers sat in silence for what felt like hours. When the lights returned, the train had traveled several kilometers farther than seemed possible. Conductors, confused and shaken, insisted that no time had passed. In hindsight, the 1970s stand as the decade when the Soviet Union tried hardest to confront the clockroom and failed. Science could not master it, secrecy could not contain it, and superstition could not protect those who strayed too close. The basement remained, sealed and waiting, an unresolved wound at the center of a city that carried on with its factories, its trains, its party slogans. But for those who knew, the truth was undeniable. Every night at 3:17 a.m., something in Perm stopped, and the world above stopped with it, if only for a heartbeat. And yet the most unsettling reports of all were those not written in files, but whispered by the few who dared to linger near the sealed door. They claimed that if you stood close enough, you could hear faint knocking from the other side. Not random banging, not echoes of trains overhead, but deliberate taps, as though something trapped in the clockroom was marking the seconds, waiting for the bricks to crumble and the hour to strike again. By the dawn of the 1980s, the Perm Clockroom had shifted from an internal embarrassment to an active source of paranoia. Moscow could not ignore the number of unexplained incidents, nor could it allow them to surface in public discourse. Files labeled Osobo Sekretno, most secret, show entire pages devoted not to scientific explanation, but to containment strategies. One line, repeated in multiple memoranda, read, "The anomaly is not to be solved, only managed." That decade saw a strange pattern, official silence above ground, but intensifying activity below. Station workers reported night convoys of military trucks pulling up to the side of the terminal, their headlights doused, men unloading equipment under the cover of darkness. Cables were run through the floorboards into the sealed stairwell. The hum of generators echoed through the halls. Yet by morning, all signs were removed, the bricks spotless once again, as though the night's events had been erased. A handful of leaked accounts describe what happened in those midnight hours. An officer later confessed that teams of scientists had been ordered to provoke the anomaly, to trigger the 317 freeze deliberately and record the results. They brought atomic clocks, high-voltage batteries, even living subjects. One such experiment allegedly involved placing several pigeons inside the basement chamber. At precisely 3:17, the birds froze mid-motion, wings outstretched. When the second passed, they fell lifeless, as if drained not of blood but of duration itself. The report describing this incident was destroyed, but a single note scrawled in the margin of a survivor's file remained. They died outside of time. Rumors spread among those stationed at the site. Soldiers spoke of men who entered the clockroom for timed exposure sessions and returned altered, their hair whitened, their speech slowed as though their words had to travel further to reach the present. Some were said to age years overnight. Others forgot entire stretches of their past, unable to remember their own names. Yet officially these casualties were listed as accidents unrelated to service. Families were given sealed coffins, buried quickly with party officials standing by. Locals, too, felt the pull of the anomaly. In 1982, a group of workers tasked with cleaning the tunnels beneath the station claimed their watches all stopped at 3:17 simultaneously, though they had been nowhere near the sealed basement. The air thickened, one of them later said in hushed tones. The tunnels grew quiet, and we thought we heard footsteps walking in a circle around us. When they returned to the surface, the station clock was 15 minutes behind, yet no one above had noticed. Folklore metastasized. Residents of Perm told stories of spectral passengers who appeared on platforms at night, dressed in outdated uniforms, carrying tickets from decades before. They stood silently until 3:17, then vanished. Some swore that freight trains passing through at that minute rattled with invisible weight, as though carrying cargo that could not be seen. Children dared each other to sneak near the station at night, pressing ears to the ground. They claimed to hear a low ticking that was not mechanical, but organic, like the beating of a heart that belonged not to a body, but to the city itself. In 1985, under the tightening grip of late Soviet stagnation, an incident occurred that nearly exposed the secret. A passenger train traveling from Perm to Sverdlovsk experienced a total blackout as it rolled past the station. Every clock aboard froze at 3:17. Witnesses described sitting in darkness for what felt like hours, hearing faint whispers in the carriages. When light returned, the train was found to be kilometers beyond where it should have been. Yet according to official timetables, no delay had occurred at all. Passengers who tried to report the event found their statements ignored, their letters unanswered. But in hushed conversations, the phrase began to circulate, "the train that lost an hour." By then, even party officials stationed in Perm were uneasy. Internal correspondence shows local cadres begging Moscow for clarification. One note reads, "Comrades are refusing night shifts. They say the station swallows their minutes. How can we build socialism if time itself defects?" The response was cold and simple. Maintain silence. All reports must describe electrical interference. To suggest otherwise is ideological sabotage. The Chernobyl disaster in 1986 shifted the atmosphere further. For many in Perm, whispers of the clockroom blended with news of radiation, cover-ups, and lies. If the state could conceal a nuclear catastrophe, why not a fracture in time? That year, an underground samizdat pamphlet appeared, titled "The Hour That Stands Still." It compiled testimonies from railway workers, passengers, and locals. One chilling story within claimed that during a midnight patrol, 2 guards saw the bricked wall of the clockroom shimmering faintly. Through it, they glimpsed rows of people sitting motionless in silence, as though waiting. Each wore a watch, frozen at 3:17. The pamphlet was seized, its authors arrested, yet copies survived, whispered from hand to hand. By the late 1980s, with glasnost loosening censorship, journalists grew bolder. A Moscow correspondent visiting Perm tried to investigate, interviewing retired railway engineers. His draft article, titled "The Basement That Holds the Night," was never published. He died in a car crash weeks later. Colleagues whispered that his notes had been confiscated. All that remained was a fragment found in his apartment. Time is not broken in Perm. It is repeating, and we are the repetition. Even as the Soviet Union began to unravel, the anomaly did not. In fact, the reports intensified. Travelers passing through Perm recounted lost time, watches freezing, train schedules collapsing. Children told their parents of dreams where the station clock struck 3:17 again and again, each strike louder than the last. And the basement remained sealed, guarded by silence, as if the party feared not what might escape, but what might finally be proven true. The 1980s, then, became the decade when the Perm Clockroom stopped being a localized curiosity and became a symbol, a secret at the heart of a collapsing empire. It embodied everything the Soviet Union could not admit, that there were limits to control, to ideology, to the mastery of nature. In a nation that claimed to command the future, here was a place where even the present refused to obey. And so the files end, as they always did, with absence. Watches frozen, reports censored, lives erased. But the second, 0317, remained, a wound that neither science nor power could close. And with every passing year, more and more began to ask a question too dangerous to voice aloud. What if the clockroom was not merely a fault in time, but a doorway? And if so, who or what was already waiting on the other side? When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, many believed its secrets would collapse with it. Files would be opened, archives unsealed, and the machinery of silence dismantled. In Perm, however, the secret of the clockroom remained buried. The new Russian state, fragile and chaotic, inherited the anomaly along with its debts and half-functioning industries. But unlike factories that could be privatized, or mines that could be stripped, the basement beneath the railway station could not be sold off, and it could not be ignored. The 1990s brought a strange mix of openness and denial. On one hand, rumors flourished in the free press. Newspapers, desperate for stories, latched onto whispers of the Perm Time basement. Tabloids published lurid accounts of trains vanishing into black corridors, of passengers who aged years overnight, of guards who went mad staring at frozen clocks. At the same time, regional officials worked harder than ever to suppress investigation. Journalists who visited the station reported being escorted away by police or threatened with fines. Some received anonymous phone calls warning them to leave the hour alone. It was as though the secrecy of the Soviet years had bled seamlessly into the new era. Survivors of the old system began to speak more freely. Retired engineers admitted that their instruments had failed night after night, no matter what the party claimed. One elderly telegraph operator confessed that he had once sent a message stamped 3:14 a.m., only to receive his own transmission 3 minutes later with the time stamped 3:17, though he had never sent it again. A former KGB guard claimed that when the basement door was unsealed briefly in the late 1980s, he saw not a room, but a corridor of ticking light, stretching into darkness, lined with clocks that did not belong to any manufacturer he recognized. His testimony was recorded by a journalist in 1992. Weeks later, the journalist vanished on his way back from Moscow, his tape recorder found abandoned in a train compartment. The new market economy provided new opportunities and new dangers. Oil and gas companies, hungry to expand in the Urals, began surveying lands around Perm. Several crews reported their digital watches and instruments failing whenever they passed near the station. A manager for one company privately wrote, "We cannot afford to drill here. The ground is not stable. It is not even in one piece." His letter was never published, but circulated quietly among local businessmen, fueling the legend. For the people of Perm, the clockroom became a symbol of everything unstable in their lives. Pensions vanished, wages went unpaid, factories closed. Time itself felt unreliable, just as it did beneath the station. Parents told children that if they stayed out too late, they might lose their minutes to the basement. Street vendors swore that their watches gained or lost whole hours when selling goods near the railway. A bus driver recounted that every night, when he drove past the station on his last route, the digital clock on his dashboard blinked to 03:17, even when it was still evening. He quit after his colleagues mocked him, but his story spread nonetheless. Amid this chaos, independent researchers and mystics tried to stake their claim. Occult groups in Moscow declared the clockroom a temporal nexus. Fringe physicists proposed theories about wormholes and dimensional fractures. A team of students from Perm University launched their own investigation in 1995. They entered the station at night with tape recorders, camcorders, and wristwatches determined to capture proof. Their devices later surfaced, but the footage was almost unusable. Static-filled, distorted, interrupted by black frames that repeated the same timestamp, 03:17. Of the 6 students, 3 returned shaken and silent, refusing to speak of what they had seen. The others were never found. Local folklore adapted. Stories claimed that during certain winters, the clockroom's influence spread across the city. Residents described nights when every clock in their homes stopped for a single minute at 03:17, restarting as if nothing had happened. One tale spoke of a boy who woke at that hour to find his parents frozen mid-breath at the kitchen table, their eyes still open. By morning, they moved again as though the night had been ordinary, but the boy insisted he had lived through an hour of silence. He was mocked at school until other children admitted they had seen similar things. By the end of the decade, Perm itself began to shift around the secret. The railway station underwent renovations, its structure modernized. Officially, the basement was demolished during construction, yet workers claimed that the stairwell could not be filled. Cement poured into the chamber hardened on the surface but left a hollow space below. Drills snapped, foundations cracked. In the end, the blueprint simply omitted the basement altogether, as though it had never existed. But everyone knew it was still there, sealed, but waiting. Meanwhile, Russia itself was unraveling. Wars in Chechnya, economic collapse, political instability. In this atmosphere, the clockroom became both less visible and more threatening. It was not just a local mystery anymore. It was a metaphor for the entire country, a wound in the fabric of time that refused to heal. Journalists wrote careful allegories about lost hours in Perm that everyone understood, but no one could openly confirm. And still, in the quiet hours before dawn, station workers whispered that if you dared to stand on the platform at 0317, you could feel the air grow still, your heartbeat stumble, your watch hesitate, as though the entire city were teetering on the edge of another reality. The 1990s ended with more questions than answers. The Soviet files were still hidden, the anomalies still unexplained, and the basement still sealed. But a new unease had taken root. If the Soviet Union, with all its machinery of secrecy, could not contain the clockroom, then what hope did the chaotic Russian Federation have? Was the anomaly waiting for the right moment to return, larger and stronger than before? Or had it already seeped into the city's veins, stretching beyond the basement, freezing minutes wherever it pleased? What was once a localized secret was now part of the landscape of Perm itself. For those who lived there, it was no longer just a basement under a station. It was a presence, woven into every night, every ticking watch, every silence that grew too long. And though the state tried to wall it off, though new times and new governments rose above it, the truth remained. 0317 was still waiting, always waiting, for those who dared to listen. By the early 2000s, the Perm Clockroom had drifted into the background of public life, yet it never fully disappeared. Officially, the basement no longer existed. Renovations were said to have filled the chamber with concrete, and the station stood proudly as a symbol of modernization. But locals knew the truth. The stairwell remained, hidden behind locked doors and fresh plaster, and the anomaly still pulsed in silence at 0317 every night. New technologies only deepened the mystery. Workers began carrying digital watches, assuming that microchips would resist whatever force had plagued the mechanical gears of their predecessors. Yet these, too, froze at the same minute. Phones powered off inexplicably when brought near the sealed area. Security cameras installed in the basement corridors malfunctioned precisely once each night, always at the same second. The footage was never stored. Supervisors explained it as routine data corruption, but guards posted nearby admitted quietly that their own hearts seemed to stutter in their chests when the moment arrived, as though the anomaly had reached beyond machinery into the human body. Stranger still were the testimonies that surfaced online. With the rise of internet forums, anonymous voices began to share what newspapers dared not print. A railway dispatcher described how, in 2001, every clock in the control room stopped simultaneously for 3 minutes. Train movements during that window could not be explained. One convoy left Perm at 0250 and arrived at the next station 40 minutes ahead of schedule, though the trip should have taken over an hour. "We skipped the interval," the dispatcher wrote. "We arrived in a place where time had not passed." His post vanished within days, deleted by moderators after a flood of unexplained pressure. Urban legends multiplied. Students dared one another to stand near the station at night, recording themselves on shaky handheld cameras. Most footage showed nothing but empty streets until the moment the camera timecode froze at 03:17. A few seconds later, the recording resumed, but objects in the background had shifted, benches moved, posters torn, shadows cast in different directions. One particularly chilling clip, circulated briefly in 2004, showed the cameraman's reflection in a window standing still while he continued moving. The video was pulled offline within hours, but those who saw it never forgot. Perm residents grew accustomed to these whispers, weaving them into their daily routines. Parents warned children not to be outside at the bad minute. Taxi drivers refused fares through the station at night. A cleaner who worked the late shift swore she saw figures moving silently on the platform when no trains were scheduled. Passengers holding briefcases, wearing old Soviet coats, all staring at the station clock as it froze. She quit the next morning, leaving her uniform neatly folded on the bench. Meanwhile, small investigative groups tried to dig deeper. In 2006, a team of independent journalists from Moscow visited Perm, hoping to record evidence. They brought advanced equipment, synchronized atomic watches, infrared cameras, high-capacity recorders. Their notebooks described strange pressure in the air as midnight approached, a vibration in the walls of the station that grew stronger by the hour. At 03:17, every device failed. When power returned, the journalists found that their tapes contained only one phrase, repeated again and again in metallic distortion: "The second has not ended." The group left Perm immediately. Weeks later, one of them died suddenly of a heart attack at age 32. The others refused to speak of their experience again. By the late 2000s, silence had returned. The Russian state, now consolidating power, issued no acknowledgement of the anomaly. Train schedules continued. Station announcements rang out. Commuters carried on as though nothing lay beneath their feet. But those who lived close to the station still whispered of the pause that came every night, the breathless second when all watches froze. Some claimed the anomaly was expanding, reaching beyond the station itself. People across the city began reporting that their clocks or phones flickered briefly at 03:17, even when miles away from the basement. Whether coincidence or contagion, the idea spread. The clockroom was no longer sealed. Its fracture in time was leaking into Perm itself. Thus, by the end of the first decade of the new century, the Perm Clockroom had become something more than an urban legend. It was a quiet certainty, carried in rumors, digital glitches, and half-remembered nights. Officials denied it, scientists avoided it, journalists feared it, but the people of Perm knew, at 03:17 a.m., something in their city still stopped, and no one, not the party, not the state, not time itself, could make it move again until it was ready. By the 2010s, the Perm Clockroom no longer belonged only to Soviet silence or whispered folklore. It had entered the unstable terrain of the digital age. Stories once passed by word of mouth now spread through forums, blogs, and underground websites. Some were dismissed as conspiracy theories. Others vanished within hours of being posted, leaving behind only broken links and corrupted archives. Yet the details remained disturbingly consistent. At 03:17 every night, something in Perm paused. The new generation of witnesses no longer carried pocket watches or analog clocks. They carried smartphones, GPS devices, and digital recorders. But even these were not immune. Users reported their phones freezing at the cursed second, alarms resetting, files duplicating themselves with corrupted timestamps. One commuter recalled sitting on the platform as his phone displayed the time 03:17 for more than 20 minutes. When it advanced to 03:18, the station around him had subtly changed. Posters different, vending machines moved, and a man sitting nearby gone without a trace. He fled the station and never returned. His online post describing the event spread quickly, before being taken down under claims of inciting panic. Researchers outside official structures attempted to gather proof. In 2012, a group of physics students from Moscow visited Perm armed with high-resolution digital clocks and live streaming equipment. Their plan was to record continuously through the fateful minute. For nearly 3 hours, the feed was uneventful. Then, as the station clock neared 03:17, the stream began to distort. Viewers saw the image glitch, looping the same frame of the students' faces again and again. When the feed resumed, the room behind them appeared subtly altered. The graffiti on the wall was gone, the light bulbs replaced by older fixtures. The students returned home shaken, their equipment corrupted. 2 months later, one of them disappeared. His friends claimed he had become obsessed, waking every night at exactly 03:17, staring at a blank wall as though waiting for something to arrive. Locals insisted the anomaly was spreading. Residents of nearby districts reported that their household clocks faltered at the same second. Some claimed to wake in the middle of the night to find their bedroom clocks blinking 03:17 endlessly, while their families lay motionless as if suspended in mid-breath. Others described dreams in which they stood in the basement of the station, though they had never been inside. In those dreams, they always saw the same thing: rows of stopped watches on the floor, ticking faintly though their hands did not move. Authorities responded as they always had, with silence. Regional officials dismissed the stories as hysteria, even as they quietly reinforced security around the station. Surveillance cameras were installed, though employees admitted the feeds went blank at the same second every night. A leaked maintenance log from 2015 recorded system-wide failure at 03:17, no anomalies detected. The contradiction was left unexplained. Meanwhile, folklore adapted to modern fears. Parents told children not to check their phones after midnight, lest the clockrooms see them. Teenagers swapped stories of friends who received mysterious text messages at 03:17, blank screens filled only with the numbers 03:17 repeating endlessly. One girl in 2016 claimed her entire call history was replaced with a single entry at that minute, an outgoing call to her own number. When she answered, she heard her own voice whisper, "Don't go downstairs." The most chilling testimony of the decade came from a former security guard who broke his silence in 2018. He claimed that every night he patrolled the station, he felt the moment coming. The air grew still, the hum of lights faded, and the building seemed to lean toward silence. At 03:17, all sound ceased. He described watching the second hand of his watch struggle to move before freezing entirely. "I would look at the stairwell door," he said, "and every night I saw shadows waiting behind it. They didn't move like people. They bent around the corners, as if they belonged to clocks, not bodies." When asked why he quit, he replied, "One night, the door wasn't closed." He refused to elaborate further. By the close of the decade, the Perm Clockroom had become both more elusive and more terrifying. It was no longer just a sealed basement beneath a Soviet station. It was a fracture bleeding into the present, infecting devices, bending memories, rewriting the smallest moments of daily life. You could live in Perm for years and never notice it, until one night you glanced at your phone, saw the frozen digits 03:17, and realized the silence had already begun. The question that haunted the city was no longer, is the anomaly real? But how far has it spread? For if time itself could be broken in one basement, what stopped that fracture from extending beyond Perm, into the Urals, into all of Russia, and beyond? And each night, as the city lay quiet under its blanket of snow, the unspoken dread returned. Somewhere beneath the station, the seconds still waited, endlessly repeating, refusing to die. By the 2020s, the Perm Clockroom was no longer just an obscure local legend. It had become a riddle woven into the city's identity, a quiet terror that neither officials nor scientists dared to confront openly. Official renovation plans claimed the basement had been filled, sealed forever under tons of concrete, yet every resident knew someone whose watch had faltered at 3:17. Every night shift worker had heard the sudden hush that seemed to bleed through the walls at that second. The anomaly endured, as constant and undeniable as the snow that blanketed the city each winter. Digital culture amplified the unease. Social media posts appeared regularly. Photos of clocks frozen at 03:17, videos that cut to static at the same second, GPS maps that erased Perm for a moment before restoring it. These posts vanished quickly, flagged as technical hoaxes or disinformation, yet they always left traces, archived screenshots, fragments reposted in hidden forums. The more the state denied them, the more people believed the truth was being actively erased. Witness testimonies grew stranger. A commuter in 2021 reported that while waiting on the platform, the station clock froze at 03:17 and the world around him fell silent. He looked up and saw dozens of passengers standing motionless, until one of them turned his head mechanically, staring straight at him with empty eyes. Then, in the next blink, everything resumed as normal. He ran from the station and never took the night train again. In 2022, a woman claimed that her phone rang at 03:17 every night for a week. When she answered, she heard not voices, but a faint ticking. She stopped picking up, but the calls continued until the phone itself stopped working. Even outside the station, the influence seemed to spread. Residents in distant neighborhoods complained of digital clocks resetting themselves to 03:17. Factory workers said conveyor belts froze for exactly 1 minute in the dead of night, then resumed without explanation. One pilot flying over Perm reported that his cockpit instruments all locked at the same time, though his plane continued to move forward without any measurable seconds passing. He later admitted he feared they had flown into a place that did not exist. Yet the most unnerving accounts came from those who claimed to glimpse the basement itself. Construction workers renovating utility tunnels near the station in 2023 stumbled upon a bricked archway, colder than the surrounding earth. When they pressed their hands to it, their wristwatches froze, the second hand shuddering at 03:17. One worker swore he heard faint knocking from behind the wall, rhythmic and deliberate. The foreman ordered the tunnel sealed immediately, and the crew was reassigned. No record of their discovery appears in municipal files. The silence of officials grew louder. Regional authorities continued to deny any anomaly, insisting the stories were products of urban superstition. Yet the pattern of disappearances around the station told another story. Missing students, vanishing homeless, lone travelers whose names never appeared again after passing through Perm. Their absence was never acknowledged, but their families whispered of the same thing: the last timestamp on their phones, their last ticket scanned, their last breath taken at the frozen second of 03:17. By now, the clockroom is no longer only in the basement. It is in every watch that hesitates, every digital screen that flickers, every silence that lasts too long. It is in the gaps of records, the corrupted files, the erased names. What began as a sealed chamber under a Soviet station has spread into the fabric of the city, as though Perm itself were slipping into the fracture. And so the question persists, heavier now than ever. What truly stops at 03:17? Is it only machinery, or is it the city itself, the people, perhaps even history? If time halts each night in Perm, what slips through in the silence before it begins again? No official will answer. No archive will reveal it. All that remains is the certainty carried by those who have felt the pause, the sense that for 1 second every night, the world is no longer ours. By the mid-2020s, the legend of the Perm Clockroom had grown into something larger than any one basement or station. It was no longer confined to hushed stories of railway workers or cryptic entries in declassified Soviet files. It had become an atmosphere that surrounded the city, a presence stitched into the fabric of everyday life. People did not ask if the anomaly was real. They asked how close they had come to it and whether they had survived the minute unnoticed. Digital traces of the phenomenon multiplied, despite the state's endless denials. Dozens of travelers posted screenshots of their phones frozen on 0317, only for the files to corrupt within hours. A researcher claimed he had recorded a continuous audio file through the fateful second, but when he played it back the next day, the entire recording was filled with the sound of heavy breathing, as if the recorder itself had been alive. Even more unsettling were scattered accounts from surveillance systems. Metro cameras in Perm that flickered to black at 0317 and returned showing hallways subtly rearranged, doors on opposite sides, posters missing, shadows that did not belong to any person present. For the people who lived nearest to the station, the clockroom was no longer a legend, but a daily ritual. At night, curtains were drawn tight and devices unplugged. Watches were left unwound, phones turned off. Families sat silently through the minute, unwilling to tempt whatever force lingered below. Some described waking with the taste of metal in their mouths at exactly 0317, even when they had not looked at a clock. Others said they dreamed of descending stairwells into a room that was not a room, filled with clocks piled like bones. Every dream ended the same way, with the second hand frozen and the unbearable sense of being watched. Investigators who tried to penetrate the secret faced the same silence their Soviet predecessors had. In 2024, a small team of urban explorers entered the station after hours with hidden cameras. Their footage streamed live for only minutes before cutting abruptly at 0317. The last frame showed the group standing before a blank wall where the stairwell had once been, except in that instant, a door seemed to shimmer faintly into view. When the feed returned the next morning, their channel was empty, all archives deleted. The explorers themselves were never seen again. Even official channels betrayed the presence of the anomaly, if only through what they omitted. Perm's municipal website briefly listed restricted subterranean access points in a public works plan before the page was erased. Transit reports noted unexplained delays at exactly the same time each night, explained away as software errors. Yet one leaked internal document carried a chilling note in the margin: stabilization attempts no longer possible, expansion radius unknown. By now, the clockroom had slipped fully into folklore, but not the kind of folklore that fades into fairy tales. It was folklore that lived on in corrupted files, in frozen screens, in whispered warnings between families. Teenagers shared dares online. Set an alarm for 0317, keep recording, see what happens. Most got nothing but static. A few never posted again. Their absence became part of the story, too, and so the mystery persists. Was it a failed Soviet experiment? Some hidden Cold War attempt to manipulate time? Was it an ancient fracture in the Urals, older than the station, older even than the city itself? Or was it something darker, a threshold deliberately sealed away, not to protect it from us, but to protect us from what waits behind it? No one can say for certain. All that is known is this: each night in Perm at 0317 a.m., something stops. Watches falter, screens freeze, breaths catch in the chest, and in that pause, in that sliver of silence, the city seems to tilt slightly out of the world, as though dangling on the edge of another timeline. The chilling question that lingers unanswered is not whether the basement still exists, but whether it ever mattered at all. Perhaps the clockroom was only the first wound, the first visible fracture, and now the split has spread into every room, every device, every life. If so, then 0317 is not merely the station's curse, it is ours. And when that second arrives tonight, as it always does, one thought will remain impossible to silence. What, exactly, is moving in the dark during the minute when everything else stands still?